So before I begin my homily, I realized that there are only about maybe 4 or 5 students in this gym who know who I am. Father Chris Winklejohn, I'm the pastor at St. Mary's, which is just up the road. I think it's the closest parish to Catholic High. So for the 4 or 5 of you who go to St. Mary's, hi. And the rest of you, it's nice to meet you. Getting into the readings today, getting into the gospel, getting into also tying it into next week when we celebrate Thanksgiving. In hearing these astounding, amazing words from the gospel, another episode from the Gospels popped into my head, which I want to start off with. In the Gospel of John, there's this story or episode where the Pharisees, they send some officers to go and arrest Jesus because they don't like what he's doing and what he is saying. And so these officers go to arrest him, and they hear him teaching and preaching, and then they return to the Pharisees empty-handed. And the Pharisees say, "Why didn't you arrest him?" And the response is, "No one has ever spoken like this man." They were mesmerized by his words. They were so novel. They weren't like the things that other people had been saying up to that point. So no one has ever spoken like this man. They're amazed at the novelty and the goodness of his words. Now we are pretty familiar with the words of Jesus. He lived 2,000 years ago, and so there have been 2,000 years for his words and his teaching to kind of permeate and penetrate our culture and our imagination. But it's helpful just to appreciate how radical Jesus' teachings are. It's helpful to go back and look at what the mindset was in Jesus' time and what the kind of the values people had in Jesus' time were. So we heard this teaching from the gospel today about loving your enemies, doing good to those who persecute you, being generous with the ungrateful and the wicked, lending to those who can give nothing back. So that's what Jesus says. And that's different from things that other people around Jesus' time said. There was an ancient Greek, I think he was a poet. His name was Hesiod. And he lived like 600-700 years before Jesus. But these were the values that he handed down, and these are the values that like the Greek culture in Jesus' time would have had. So this is what Hesiod said, not Jesus, but Hesiod. This is what people would have maybe thought. Love those who love you, and help those who help you. Give to those who give to you, never to those who do not. So the values at Jesus' time and in his culture, they were kind of like, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. You can do something for me, I can do something for you. You're not going to do anything for me, I'm not going to do anything for you. And then there were some religious communities that existed around Jesus' time, and in their teachings, they spelled out under what conditions you could hate your enemy. So, if your enemy meets criteria A, B, C, and D, then you have permission to hate that person. So those were the kind of the values that people had in Jesus' time. But these aren't just features of kind of an old or ancient morality. Not too long ago, I was listening to a podcast that discussed some current event issues, political issues, cultural issues. And although I agreed with the person's positions, the tone with which they spoke, they had the right positions, in my opinion, on some cultural issues. But the people that they disagreed with, it wasn't just the people they disagreed with were wrong, but the people they disagreed with were bad. They were evil. They were stupid. Not just wrong, not just they disagree with you, but you're also bad and you're evil and you're wrong and you have no claim to my respect. So, some of these values that, existed before Jesus came, they still, we still have these tendencies today. But Jesus tells us to do something radically different. He tells us to love our enemies, not to hate our enemies, but to love our enemies. And what he is calling us to do, what he is calling his followers to do, is he's calling us to have, and use two big words, to have benevolence, willing the good of other people, and to have magnanimity. Magnanimity is this largeness of spirit, this generosity of spirit. The opposite of magnanimity is pettiness. Jesus is saying, don't be petty, be magnanimous. Have this largeness of spirit, this generosity of spirit towards other people. And what he's trying to get his followers to do is the things that they consider, the criteria, that run through our minds, a follower of Jesus' minds, when we're interacting with another person. They aren't supposed to be, is this person worth my time? Is this person worth my respect? Is this person worth my generosity or my love? The criteria doesn't rest in, is this person worthy of it? But the criteria is supposed to rest in asking, not what kind of person is that, and should I engage with them, but what kind of person am I? Am I a generous person? Am I a patient person? Am I a loving person? Am I a magnanimous person? Hopefully we all want to be those things. And in figuring out how to engage with not only people that we like, but people that we don't like, the question isn't, is that person, do they meet my criteria? Are they good enough for me? But am I good enough to love them? Am I good enough to engage with them? So Jesus is trying to flip it around. Don't take into consideration the other person's merits and how you engage with them, but take into consideration your merits, or the merits that you want to have, and how you're going to engage with them. Jesus does the same thing it was a bit of a tangent, but if you think of the parable of the Good Samaritan, if you're familiar with that parable, if you're not, go look it up. But Jesus does the same thing. He kind of flips the script. It starts out with the person asking, well, who is my neighbor? Wanting to know, okay, what criteria does another person have where I have to help them? And then what criteria can they have where I can be excused from helping them? And Jesus flips the script by, at the end, he gets the person he's in a discussion with to think, not, is that person a neighbor, but am I being a neighbor? So Jesus wants us not to consider the merits of others, but to look to ourselves and say, am I a generous person? Am I a magnanimous person? And if I am, then that's going to determine how I engage with this other people. Just practically speaking, trying to make this a little bit concrete, and I'm going to bring this down to the very mundane, day-to-day level. I'm not going to bring in, the complicated issues of like, if somebody really strikes you on the cheek, how do you respond to that? Or if somebody really robs you, how do you respond to that? Those are kind of outlier cases, but just the day-to-day stuff. These things happen all the time. There's somebody in your life who just rubs you the wrong way. They're annoying, they're irritating. There's some personality quirk that you just don't like. You see them coming and you think, all right, how can I avoid them? How can I just not even engage with them? Or if I have to engage with them, how can I just keep it as short as possible? Give them the minimal amount of attention that I can possibly give. And when we think that way, again, we're thinking, what qualities does this person have? And do their qualities make them worth my attention? And that's the wrong thing to think. Instead, what we want to try and think about is, am I the kind of person who can be patient towards this other person? Am I generous enough? Am I magnanimous enough? Am I big enough to give this person some of my attention? Show them genuine interest. Am I magnanimous or am I petty? We all want to be magnanimous. Now this is very difficult to do, no doubt about it. And so how do you get there? How do you get to having that generosity, that largeness of spirit, that magnanimity? It all comes back to God. Something that was a theme throughout both the gospel and the first reading today is that all of these ways that we are expected to behave towards others, towards our brothers and sisters, and towards our enemies, they all flow from the fact that we are children of God. God has loved us in this way. God didn't look at us and say, oh, does this person meet my criteria? Is this person good enough for me to engage with? And okay, yeah, they are good enough for me to engage with, and so I will engage with them. I will love them. I will die for them. That's not the way that God looks at us. God loves us because of who he is. God loves us because he is good. He is magnanimous. He is overflowing with love. He is overflowing with mercy. He is rich in mercy. He isn't poor and stingy in mercy, but he is rich in mercy. And he shares that richness with us. And so from that richness, from that fullness that he has shared with us, we also are not just called to, but we're equipped to have that same generosity and that same generosity towards others. So it all comes back to God. Every time that Jesus tells us to behave a certain way, you can always find in the Gospels the way that he has behaved. So when he's saying love your enemies, he loved his enemies. When he says turn the other cheek, he was struck on the cheek in his trial, in his passion. So it all comes back to Jesus. And in order to have the ability, in order to have the grace to love this way, the Lord invites us to spend some time really understanding and appreciating and being grateful for the way that God has loved us so generously and so completely and so fully. So it all starts with that, experiencing and being aware of God's just extravagant love for us. And then from the appreciation of that, we have the grace and the fuel to be able to love others in that way. So that brings me to a final point, and to tie this into Thanksgiving. The way that we grow in this is by being grateful for it, by being aware of it, and by being grateful for it, by being thankful for it. One of the ways that we show our thanks to God is by loving others in the way that God has loved us. Thanksgiving for God's gifts is no small thing, and it's something that is worth spending some time doing, praying about, spending some quiet time in your room or in the chapel or in the church or something like that, of just saying, Lord, help me to be grateful of the ways that you have been good to me, you have been generous to me, you've been merciful towards me. Gratitude is so important. One of my favorite saints, St. Ignatius of Loyola, he has some words about both ingratitude and then gratitude. So it starts on ingratitude, it starts kind of on a negative note, but it finishes on a positive note. So I'll leave you with this. St. Ignatius says, of all imaginable evils and sins, one that most merits the loathing of our Creator and Lord. Now, think about what would be the sin that most merits God's loathing. Ignatius says that it is the sin of ingratitude, being a refusal to acknowledge the goods, graces, and gifts that we have received. So ingratitude is that refusal to acknowledge God's gifts, and it's in Ignatius' opinion, it's the worst of all sins and evils. So that's the bad news. But then you flip it around. He says, on the other hand, acknowledgement and gratitude for goods and gifts received is so highly loved and esteemed, both in heaven and on earth. So being grateful for God's gifts is something that is so good to do, and we should spend time being grateful for God's gifts, being grateful of his love, his magnanimity towards us, so that we can, like him, love others, be merciful to others as he has been towards us.